we sort of started with work while, in this sort of midst of technological change, but I think it's a different scale to what Gen Z are experiencing. It's like maybe with millennials, it's like, oh, my job might be gone in 5 years. Gen Z, it's like, my job might not exist next year. And so this sort of old school style of managers of, oh, just work really hard at these things and tick these boxes, and then you'll sort of move up the organization doesn't really work.
Welcome to You Belong in the C-Suite podcast. You are ambitious in life and in your career, but something is missing. You want to bring more of your passion to what you do. Because let's be honest, you pour a ton into your work, and it needs to mean more. I'm your host, Laura Eigel. I'm a mom, wife, PhD, coach, advocate, introvert, and indoor rowing fanatic. I'm passionate about living a life that's in line with my values. We'll give you the actionable tips and tools you need to lead with your values, make a difference, and have career success. The world needs more diversity and authenticity in the top jobs at organizations. Your leadership belongs there. You belong in the C-Suite. What gets you up in the morning? What drives your decisions? What do you stand for? No idea, not even sure where to start? I use my values to guide my life and career. It's the basis of how I've built boundaries for myself and stuck to them. Are you ready to dig into what matters to you? Go to thecatchgroup.com to download your free values worksheet. That's thecatchgroup.com to download your free values worksheet to get to your core values and take action on what matters most. Welcome to this week's episode of the You Belong in the C-Suite podcast. I'm excited to share my conversation with Anisa Purbasari Horton. Anisa is a freelance writer and editor who covers the workplace and leadership. She's edited and written for numerous publications, including BBC.com, Business Insider, and Fast Company, where she is currently a contributing editor for the Work Life section. In our conversation, we talked about Anisa's career journey and how she shifted her career focus from law to journalism, and how now she covers topics of leadership and everything workplace. I reached out to Anisa after reading her article in Fast Company called The Ultimate Guide for Millennial Managers Working with Gen Z. And I reached out to her because I had several leaders that I coach and work with ask me about how to best manage their Gen Z direct reports, because there's been some conflicts coming up. So before we get into it, first let's talk about who Gen Z is. So Generation Z is the youngest generation in the workforce right now. So they're born from 2012 to 1997. So the oldest Gen Z are in their mid to late 20s, and the youngest are still in middle school. Millennials, the next oldest generation, born 1981 to 1996, which means that the oldest millennials are in their early 40s, and at this point, most likely managing multiple people, including Gen Z. Older generations to note, the next one is Gen X, born from 1965 to 1980, and boomers, who are people who were born between 1946 and 1964. Listen, I will tell you, there are lots of generations in the workplace, and there are even more generations that I didn't mention. But I will say everybody belongs to a generation. And at some point, it becomes sometimes part of an identity, or even most often a stereotype. But generations generally are a beginning and end points. And a lot of these years that I just mentioned to you, there's different definitions to them, depending on who you ask. There's even some research to show that generations are a construct that we shouldn't even be studying. Instead, that life stage is the unit of analysis that we should look at. However, the idea of a generation is something I don't think is ever going away. And as new generations come into the workforce, there's always talk about the conflict as the new generations, what they want and how they're so unreasonable, right? So much early in my career, I was doing research as millennials were entering the workforce and the conflicts that they had with their other generation. So this topic, I don't think, is ever going to go away. And as soon as a new generation comes into the workplace, they'll always be a little bit different and we'll talk about what they want, right? And so today, because it's timely, we are talking to Anisa about the current preferences of Generation Z and what millennials or Xers or boomers can do to manage them. And so I will tell you the answer that you will hear from our conversation may not be what you think. Okay, so I want you to keep an open mind here. We talked about the points of conflict at work, the impact of the pandemic on Gen Z and their expectations. And we also talked about the strengths of Gen Z and why we maybe should hopefully be a little bit more like them. So I'll give you a hint on one of my favorite topics of our conversation. The topic is on boundaries. And guess who is really good at setting them? You'll have to listen to hear the answer, but Anisa and I talk about this and about a few other topics of interest, like overachievers. And I'm just so excited for you to learn from Anisa. And I know that this episode will be an important one for any manager to listen to, regardless of what generation you are or what generation your direct reports are. Let's get started. Well, I want to welcome you to the You Belong in the C-Suite podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
So I'm happy to be here. It's weird being on the other side because I'm usually the one doing the interview. So the preparation was, a little bit interesting.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you're on the other side. So I'm just really excited to have you on and talk about the topic that we're going to get into here in a bit. I found you through an article that you wrote in Fast Company about millennials managing Gen Z. And so the reason that I was even looking for that was I've had, a couple of clients here in the same week talk about some conflicts that they've had. And I was like, okay, I need to find somebody. We need to chat. We need to talk. I actually used to do some research around when millennials were entering the workforce. So it's really interesting for me to see, and this was many years ago, right? When they were like in their 20s. And so it's really interesting to see, again, this topic comes up, right? This topic of the youngest generation in the workforce and all the things. And so we'll get into all of that. But first, before we do that, I want to hear more about you. And you mentioned that you're usually on the other side. So tell us more about your career story and just a little bit more about you.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Anisa, and I'm currently a freelance journalist. I've been so for, I think, about 5 years, and then I was, on staff at several media publications before that, and I've been both an editor and a writer and a reporter, sorry. And I cover mostly leadership, management, anything around the intersection of work and life and the human side of work, as we call it. And yeah, this is definitely a really interesting topic because, I started as a millennial in the workplace, and there are definitely some similarities around sort of what I'm seeing now amongst the discourse in Gen Z, although we're definitely in a different reality. But before I was a journalist, I actually started my career as a lawyer. That did not last long. Luckily, as you can probably tell by my accent, I'm from the Southern Hemisphere. I'm from New Zealand, and there you can do your law degree as an undergraduate. So I didn't need to carry lots of debt the way that North American law school students have to. And I just did my 4-year degree, sort of did this sort of summer internship and got a job before I graduated, thought I was set for life, found out quickly that it was not what I wanted to do. And I really tried to stick it out, but I think sometimes when something is just not working out, there comes a point when you're sort of forced to change course. And that's actually sort of where I really learned and became very interested about sort of success in the workplace. I remembered reading a lot of the articles that I sort of would later write and edit. And I had always, wanted to be a journalist. That was my dream. I just sort of took what I thought was the safe route. Ended up moving to New York City to study a master's in journalism at NYU, did a few internships, covering sort of like a range of things from like health and wellness, tech. And eventually sort of landed at Fast Company, where I did a bunch of things, but that's where I sort of really mostly started writing and editing stories around these kinds of topics. So I would report on these issues, and then I would also work with a lot of non-journalists, so CEOs, academic leaders, managers, senators, to sort of write about the expertise and help them publish it so that it's more for a mainstream audience. And then, yeah, I went freelance about, I don't know, COVID. So I guess it was 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I've sort of continued doing that, but I guess I've sort of branched out now, and I don't just write for media publications. I've also mainstream publications. Sorry, I also have written for B2B sort of publications and for company blogs. And so that sort of has allowed me to learn about these issues from many different angles, and cater to many different audiences.
I love that you were in it and you realized it was not for you and you did that pivot that many people do. And I love that you did it so early. I feel like that's not the case for a lot of folks.
No, it's funny because I think at the time I felt like it was late, even though like I was like 25 or 26, and I'm 35 now. So I just think I was a baby. Like, why was I so worried? But I think we were talking before we started recording about the sort of high achieving mindset. I think I was definitely in that sort of, I think I was definitely, especially in law school, that is the kind of environment that attracts the type A high achieving people. And I think I just sort of got swept up in the whole, like, oh, you have to make the right decision. And it's all about working through, your career as fast as you can. And I don't know, like it felt quite scary to just jump into a new career. And, a lot of my peers were younger than me. A lot of them had, like, it was, even though it was a graduate program, a lot of them, they hadn't been in the workplace. They just went straight from undergrad, which, has its own benefits. But I definitely felt like, having had some sort of work experience, there was something that I could bring to there was something that I found a lot easier, especially when it came to internships and, just getting used to sort of the workplace and the 40 hours. It's all that similar. It's all that really small thing that really make a difference when you've already been there. And so, yeah, like it was scary, but I think I was sort of like forced into it because I was just so miserable that I was thinking, well, if this is going to fail, like what's the worst that could happen? I have to go back and get a less stressful law job. Like it's not really that bad.
Yeah, but you're right. Like in the moment, it feels like very big. But to your point, like you were very young when you figured that out. And I think a lot of folks stick it out longer, especially some of those high achievers, right? Because they know that they're smart enough to figure it out. And so I think they want to prove it, not really to anybody else, but just to themselves that like, hey, maybe I didn't make this mistake. I can figure this out. I can work here. I can stay in this job or stay at this company or whatever it is. And so, yeah, high achievers, like we could talk on and on about that one too. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
I know. And I think, sometimes being too good at a job can also actually be, I don't want to say a bad thing, but it can be a trap, because if you're not happy in your situation, but you're still performing really well. I saw a lot of people, and we'll get into this later when we talk about the managerial side, where it was obvious that they were unhappy, but they were really good at their job and they were high performing. And, I think, especially in an industry like law, even though they work so much, that I think the compensation per hour is actually personally not that great. But at the time, I think that there is a golden handcuff situation of like,
yes,
I'm earning this much, I'm used to this lifestyle, and then there's a lot of other things that comes with it, like you get flown on business class when you are negotiating with clients, and you get wine and dine and all of that stuff that on their salaries maybe they couldn't afford. So there was a lot of that as well. But
I think you make a very important point, this idea of the golden handcuffs, which might make for not so great managers. I think that, I mean, if you are working for a person who's really good at their job, but they're not happy, like that's not a great place to be or to learn leadership from. And so I think there's a lot of those.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely will talk about that, because that is a huge thing.
Yeah. So I found you through your article in Fast Company. And we will link it in the show notes so that everybody has access to it. But this idea of millennials are, mid-career at this point now, some of the older ones. All right. So younger than 26, 27 right now is Gen Z, and then 45 and down to like 28 is
28,
millennials. But really it's like also what do you consider yourself as well, I would imagine. Because generations are just that. It's like there's so many definitions of them. There's so many and we're trying not to have a stereotype here, right? But individuals are individual.
Exactly.
But there are differences in trends and preferences, and a generation is usually formed by the events that happen to them, right? And so
absolutely,
the thing that happened to Gen Z at a very formidable time, some of them during high school or college or post that, was the pandemic that we just talked about. And so that is very interesting that we can talk about as well. But as we think about what Gen Z even wants, these are folks that are in college, out of college, entering the workforce, right? And so what do they want at work? What's really important to them?
I mean, most of these answers are just general sort of management practice. I've talked to a lot of managers, most of whom are millennials. And I do just want to say that, as I mentioned earlier, this point of view comes from interviewing other managers who have worked with Gen Z. So this is not my personal experience. I'm a self-employed millennial journalist with no Gen Z employees. So the first one I think is just someone who sets clear expectation while respecting boundaries. So when I started in the workforce, which was over a decade ago, I was, I'm squarely in the millennial generation. It was in the height of sort of girl boss, lean in, hustle culture era. There was definitely the whole sort of do what you love situation, but I think that there was still a lot of focus on molding ourselves to the workplace and to our manager's style of working. Certainly I remembered complaining about toxic managers to my peers, but I don't remember any conversation around boundaries or, thinking that they needed to work on themselves. It was all like, okay, how do we deal with this? How do we get through it? And the focus was a lot more on the employee changing. And what I'm hearing from managers, especially millennial managers, is that Gen Z are a lot better at boundary setting. So there's an idea that they're lazy and entitled and they're not hardworking. And what I'm hearing is that that's not true at all. They're just as ambitious. They're sometimes even more so. They're just ambitious and hardworking in a different way. They don't sort of follow a prescribed path of climbing the corporate ladder, or they don't necessarily follow a specific rule or a specific, I think like to them, success has many different forms. It's not just about climbing the corporate ladder and earning this amount of salary or getting to this title. And so with that comes, I guess, also a different way of working. And they want, I think when they sort of want their expectations of work to be aligned with practice, which I don't necessarily think, I think in previous generations, maybe there was a lot of unwritten expectation that gets built into work and you sort of have to accept them. Like, say your contract says that you're working 40 hours, but then actually your real work is that you're working 50 to 70 hours. And then it's sort of just expected that you will conform to that. I mean, of course, there are industries where that probably is still the case. Like I'm sure in finance and law, that is still the case. But I think in a lot of situations, Gen Z are just more sort of firm about setting boundaries where maybe the expectations there's been a misalignment. And so a manager, I think, has to be open to that conversation so that they can come to a reality that suits both of them. The second thing is, you have mentioned the pandemic, and I think that that's a reality that is different about the work that, the sort of the world that the Gen Z is entering compared to the world that maybe millennials and boomers have entered. I mean, they had their own challenges, but the pandemic, I can't remember when the last pandemic was. It was a long time ago. And so I think just being aware of that reality, and then, pandemic also has resulted in a lot of economic volatility. The labor market, the power dynamics keeps changing. There was a point when I think it was an employer's market, and then it was an employee's market, and I don't know where we are now because
I think we're swinging back. I think we're swinging back
yeah,
to an employer organization market now.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then you sort of see companies hiring a lot and then laying them off 6 months later. And then, we've made a lot of stride in things like artificial intelligence, which has changed a lot of job. And so I think, millennials, especially, like, we sort of started with work while, in this sort of midst of technological change, but I think it's a different scale to what Gen Z are experiencing. It's like maybe with millennials, it's like, oh, my job might be gone in 5 years. Gen Z, it's like, my job might not exist next year. And so the sort of old school style of managers of, oh, just work really hard at these things and tick these boxes, and then you'll sort of move up the organization, doesn't really work because if, first of all, a lot of Gen Z don't, what I'm also hearing anecdotally, they don't aspire to be managers the same way that previous generations have. And even if they do, by the time they get to that place, what it means to manage employees might be very different. And so I think what I'm hearing a lot from managers is they need to tweak their management style so that it's more about cultivating a learning environment where they can adapt and be resilient. Because a lot of Gen Z workers are aware that their job is not, like, quote unquote secure, and it could change tomorrow. And then the last one, and I apologize for using this word because I feel like this word gets overused, but they do want someone who is authentic and leads by example. We were talking earlier about sort of toxic, or I had mentioned earlier about toxic managers. Usually I find that toxic managers tend to lead by fear, right? They instill fear in their subordinates to do certain things, and it's very much a negative sort of motivation. It's like, if you don't do this, then, you might get fired. That's basically what it is. And I don't know about you, but in my experience, whenever I've had those managers, there's usually a misalignment between their personal and work life, because if there isn't, they just would not be using that style of leadership, because that is like kind of the thing that people resort to when they're in fight or flight mode. And, it's just like the quickest thing, but then it isn't sustainable in the long term. And so, yeah, one of the things that I keep hearing is that Gen Z can spot BS and are not afraid to call it out. And so I think sort of the importance of being true to yourself, and then, millennial managers can take a page out of Gen Z playbook and set their own boundaries so that they can be their best at work. Because that's what I'm hearing is that, when Gen Z sees a manager who is true to themselves, sets really clear boundaries, and is really sure in who they are, that's when they are inspired to work hard and be leaders and, be more loyal to an organization. So
that ending recap you just did, oh my goodness, like so good. I think in general, the things that every youngest generation, I think there's always a thing about the youngest generation wants all this stuff, and
I know.
So I think first and foremost, every generation feels like that, right? There's always, absolutely. It happened to millennials, it happened to Gen X, like all the things. And so Gen X were slackers, right? Millennials wanted work-life balance, and now
entitled.
Entitled. And now Gen Z has boundaries. But I will say, what the youngest generation wants is always good for everybody. Always.
Yeah, exactly.
It is always good for everybody. And they just have the confidence and empowerment to ask for it sooner. And then the rest of us are like, dang it, why didn't we do that? Like, that's not fair. Yeah. So then we feel bad because, like, we didn't get that. And so sometimes we like dig in even more, and we're like, well, I had to do XYZ. You have to do that too. Well, actually, no, you don't. And so the being able to have those boundaries, I coach high achieving leaders, and that is the thing that I work with them almost mostly, is building boundaries, because they are so not great at it, and they want it so bad. But also they have been incentivized in other ways. We talked about golden handcuffs. They're at a place in their careers where they absolutely could have boundaries because they have given, probably so many hours in their companies and traded off all this stuff. But often they don't feel like they can. And so it's fascinating that now the Gen Z's coming in and they're not only doing it, they're expecting it, right? And they're expecting it of their managers. It's fascinating, and I love that they're doing that because we need more of that at work. And if that's something that we can learn from Gen Z, I think that's amazing. I also really love I know it's overplayed, like you said, the idea of authenticity. And so, but you're right, they can totally call you out on stuff if they think that you are not authentic, or if they think that that is not real, or, hey, why do we do that way? That seems not right. Like, it feels like we're wasting time. Why don't we do it this way? Right. And then the other thing that I think that they saw as being part of the pandemic was they saw that you could work from home and they saw that also, and they felt like they also wanted more community, because a lot of them got kind of robbed that way, right? They didn't get to go to college for some years. They were online, and they crave the community too. And so I think we're missing out, the employers are kind of missing out on how do we, when they are in office, how do we create really good experiences for them, not to mandate where they work, give them the freedom, but also create community when we are together. And I think it's one of those things where millennials, we had the commute, right? We had to go in the office. We didn't have a choice. Working from home was oh my goodness, that was amazing when we could every now and then, right? But they saw it because they had to do it. So they know it can be done. And so it's interesting now seeing potentially it feels like we're kind of going backwards in some of the autonomy that people have gotten at work, and just what their expectations are. It's just so fascinating to me. You mentioned what they want and sometimes what they don't get. So where do you see these conflicts between Gen Z and millennials show up most, and what are those kind of pain points?
Yeah, so going back to the idea of boundaries, what I'm hearing from millennial managers is that while Gen Z are not afraid to call out boundaries, millennials, we're not so great at them. Which is probably why now you are seeing a lot of therapy content.
Yeah.
And they're probably, a lot of them are, millennials that have started to sort of realize that they have how lack of boundary setting has impacted their life. So there's a little bit of that in that, a lot of millennials are new managers. And I think when you do anything for the first time, they're not going to be great at it immediately. And they might be subconsciously modeling on some of the ways that their bosses have led them. And you had mentioned the whole sort of, I went through it, so you had to do it too, which I always just think is such a stupid concept, because it's why do you have to give someone unnecessarily trauma? That's just not going to be great in the long term. It's okay, maybe one off, you can use fear as an example. We all have deadlines and situations where you're in a heightened state, and then that can push. But if you just have that constantly, that's not great for anyone. They're just going to hate you.
Yeah.
It's not going to be great for the manager. And so that I have been told is a sort of pain point, in that Gen Z are not, Gen Z is very confident when it comes to setting boundaries, and millennials are not so. And so they're caught in the middle of, trying to be this manager, but then also setting their own boundaries. The second one is, you had mentioned community. That is something that I think it's a conflict, because they also expect a lot more out of work, I think, than maybe a previous generation. The pandemic, they lost out on physically going to a campus, the college experience, high school graduation, and online communities. I know, can be powerful, but it's just not the same. And so, I think the economic reality as well, with things like people are living in cities longer, there may be delaying sort of, quote unquote traditional markers of adulthood, like long-term partnership and having children later. And that means that they're sort of seeking community more at work. And I think that's, I feel like millennials sort of had that as well, but to a lesser extent because they didn't experience the pandemic. And I think there's a conflict sometimes because on the one hand, they want boundaries and work-life balance, but then they're also looking for, socialization opportunities. I personally don't think that's a manager thing. To me, that seems like a company thing because it's
Yeah.
like at the end of the day, a manager can only do so much. They're still an employee of the company and they still have a boss that they answer to.
Mm-hmm.
So that's more of a company culture at the C level where they sort of maybe have to think about ways where they can introduce opportunities for networking or maybe things like mentorship programs where Gen Z can cultivate that kind of relationship organically.
My award-winning book, Values First: How Knowing Your Core Beliefs Can Get You the Life and Career You Want, is now available in audiobook. Since the book released just last year, the biggest question that I've gotten from readers is it available in audiobook? In this book, you'll get to hear my most pivotal career stories and some of the successes of my clients as you learn about the Values First framework and how you can take action on your life and career. The audiobook is narrated by me, so if you love this podcast, you'll love the audiobook. Values First: How Knowing Your Core Beliefs Can Get You the Life and Career You Want is now available on Audible and iTunes. I wonder what role even team has as millennial managers, whatever sense of team community. I'm not going to use the word family because that feels toxic, right? At work. But what part of your team dynamic and your team culture can you bring kind of community into? And to be able to do that at a smaller scale, isn't that maybe not as impactful, but it could be a place to start, or with peers potentially if multiple managers are bringing teams together in an intentional way.
Yeah, and like I think one of the things that I'm also hearing about is that, obviously things like sort of organizing out of work social activities and all these sort of like networking situation is a lot more time consuming. And like I said before, that's more on the company rather than individual managers. But one of the things that I keep hearing is that, I think this whole idea of your work self and your home self and you're divided into all these different selves. Gen Z doesn't have as much of that, and part of it is probably because of the internet. They just have a self that they bring to different parts of their life. And so I think one simple thing that doesn't take any additional effort or time, well, it takes like emotional effort, but it doesn't take, an additional time, is just creating an environment where that's allowed. And, obviously it's still a workplace. You do have to, there are things that are, going back to boundaries, there are things that are not appropriate in the workplace. But I think just I have heard, incorporating things like it sounds really stupid, but I have heard one manager say even, asking about their pet or like what Netflix show they're watching and sort of conversation, and then like writing them down so you can, I guess, talk to your employees about personal stuff beyond just beyond just the work that you're doing. That can go a long way. And then I think the team dynamics can absolutely play into that.
Yeah, it feels like it's really holistic connection, right? Like you said, it is not, and I hate that we say work-life balance because it's like, and I kind of don't like integration either, but just
and it's never balanced.
It's not balanced.
Stages. You have stages.
Yeah, you have stages and different life stages, different all the things, and I feel like I talk a lot about values, and on purpose, I don't want people to have work values versus like life values. You are one human and you have stuff that you care about. And that's that's one list. And so to your point, it's what is important as a manager, what is important to your direct report? What do they value? How do they want to get recognized? How do they like to learn? What is exciting to them after they log off their computer? Whatever it is, like a Netflix show, a workout, their dog, whatever, like getting to know them as just a human, just like you are, it just gets back down to human connection. And that seems like a cliche, I think, but I think a lot of us forget that at the end of the day, if we can get connection with our employees on really who they are, what motivates them, when they are performing or aren't performing, you can have these, if you have that connection, hopefully that builds trust and you can have trusting conversations and giving them feedback. What do you think is the preference of Gen Z on feedback? Like, do they want it as often as millennials? Do they need it directly? Does it depend on the person? Tell me more about that.
So what I've heard is that there's not really a pattern and it's different for every individual. So actually one of the things I had forgot to mention, one of the things that also I kept hearing from managers was they should have a conversation with their Gen Z direct reports about things like what is their working style, and that includes, what kind of feedback do you like? Do you want individual feedback, or do you prefer to sort of do it as you go? And so that it doesn't seem to be a pattern. It's just really what the individual preferences are.
Yeah.
And so I think the onus is on the manager to find that out before at the start of their working relationship, and then tweak that as they go, and maybe change if it's appropriate. But yeah, I haven't heard any sort of clear preference for one or the other.
Yeah, and I think that's important to personalize the feedback anyway. And so
Yeah.
when it comes back down to it, knowing your direct report, sometimes I think that we get caught up in oh, they're Gen Z, or oh, they're millennial, whatever it is. And we forget that, no, that's a person.
Yeah, they're a human being.
They're a human
with their
being.
own quirks and preferences.
Yeah, they're not a monolith of all the young people in the world, but they care about different things, and they want to learn from you. I think that's a very just something that we don't think about, that we want to learn from our managers, I would guess. So I teach in the graduate school SMU, and so I get to see some Gen Z talk about work and their expectations. So it's really fascinating to see. And they really want to learn from people. They want to be mentored. They want to be able to ask a question in a safe environment, and they want to know if they're doing well or not. And it feels like they're really hungry to dive in. I'd say maybe they're a little bit more purpose driven. I don't know. Do you see that?
I think so. Because I think with the sort of like everything that's going on in the world, there's a lot of disillusionment around what work can bring. Because I feel like millennials were sort of oversold. I think millennials came to the workplace where the corporate world was branded as this sort of like way to find meaning and get your whole sort of self-worth from it, and then sort of maybe get advance through their careers. They realize, oh, maybe this isn't actually the case, especially if they're doing something that that's not aligned with their personal values. And I think Gen Z can see that. And so that's probably why maybe they think, well, it's not like any of the even professions that used to be stable are probably not anymore, especially with AI. Like, when I entered like law, for example, there was still a stable profession. And now AI could probably do it. To be honest, like when I think about what I was doing as a junior lawyer, AI can do a lot of that, because a lot of it was just research. And, if they have access to the like database that lawyers use to access cases and legislations, I don't really see any reason why AI can't do what junior lawyers can do. And so yeah, the purpose driven thing is definitely something that I think Gen Z is a lot more open to, and they're more driven by that. And another thing I do want to mention is on the hunger for learning. This is just my observation, so I don't necessarily know if this is true, but I feel like it seems like maybe that's why a lot of them are so active on social media. And there's all these sort of like, there's a word for it, for influencer education, influencer or something. I don't know. I could be wrong, but there's a reason why those people, there's a reason for the rise of that, is that they're also probably less trusting of institutions and, big corporations, and people that used to be, like organizations that maybe used to be seen as like honest and trustworthy, they are less trusting of that, and so they're looking for alternative sources. It's obvious that they want to be mentored and they want some sort of guidance, and so they're looking for alternative sources of that in social media. And I think that that's a gap where maybe managers can step in. I mean, it's they play a different role, but if they do have the more sort of authority, not authority figures, but maybe mentor figures they have in their life, maybe the less they will look to alternative sources that are not always the most reliable or necessarily qualified, because you don't need a qualification to teach someone to do something on the internet.
Yeah, the other thing I think too is they learn about others' work experiences on TikTok and Instagram. And usually they're extreme cases. So there's like accounts that are just about toxic bosses or calling out organizations, or, people now film their Zoom meetings and they put them on the internet, like all that kind of stuff. And so it's interesting with how fast you can see and learn about, different kinds of managers that you don't want to have, right? On some of those platforms. And what I don't see as much is the really great managers and what they are doing. And I think that's not that that's not fair, but I think they just see there's a lot of extremes there on social media.
I mean, social media is probably tailored to gain the most engagement from negativity, right?
Yeah.
And then I would imagine that if there was a good manager, even if it's genuine, people would just be skeptical.
Yeah.
Be like, what are you selling? Are you going to tell me to buy a link in your course?
Yeah, right.
That.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Oh, but it's interesting because I think they can learn about what to do in corporate. Like I see a lot of accounts like, how do I ask for this in corporate speak, right? Or how do I do this in a corporate way? And so I think they're trying to influence and fit in different ways, but I think the best way is for them to see some really great modeled behavior from, like you said, from their manager. What a great opportunity that so many managers have now that they probably don't realize to model some of those things that they're really asking for.
And on sorry, it's just like you mentioned corporate speak, and I remembered another point that came up was that was another pain point that Gen Z and millennials, I think, are in conflict, because it's not that they're necessarily comfortable with millennials, but because we've been at work for longer, millennials seem to be more comfortable with corporate speak, whereas Gen Z, and then like I think I've seen research about sort of how a lot of them struggle with interpersonal skills because of the pandemic. This is not something that has been confirmed anecdotally by the managers I interviewed, but I can understand how that might be the case. So sometimes, I think they had mentioned specifically communicating by emojis, for example. And you do that now. I think also the difficult thing is with things like Slack, you do that to your colleagues anyway.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just that now Gen Z sort of does it maybe in an email and in other ways, and that's not necessarily appropriate. So that's one where they've said that's something where maybe the millennial managers have to work with Gen Z to be like, look, there's a way to communicate authentically in a way that's still professional.
Yeah, and so I would guess that there's probably lots of those conversations happening between millennial managers and Gen Z employees. I know I see it like just in communication. It doesn't, I think I even see it with my own kid, right? Like as he emails, I say, okay, don't just start it with what you want. Like start the email to your teacher, explain who you are, what you need, like all the things. And so I think sometimes we even just need to slow down and remind ourselves that, there was a huge pandemic, and a lot of those communication skills literally weren't learned or caused a lot of different anxieties and different things like that. And so I think even more patience and the ability to teach and learn in real time. I also see, unfortunately, a lot of millennial managers and managers in general, they still aren't really confident in giving feedback in a timely way. Like they want to give, like they feel bad about it. They want to give them kind of grace or whatever, but then it comes to a point where they're just like, oh my goodness, they keep doing this. And then their frustration is high, their patience is low. And again, it's like, well, if we would have given them timely feedback the first time it happened, they will probably listen because they want to do well, just like anybody. But if they don't know better, if they don't know the quote unquote professional way to do it, which again will vary with every organization. I think some are a lot more formal. Even some organizations are not as formal as they used to be. But there's still like a way that, different organizations talk within their culture. But you can, that manager, it could be their obligation to be, again, that mentor and give that feedback in those cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like the whole sort of, oh, I could have just get timely feedback thing is not a generational thing. I think that happens with every generation. And as I mentioned before, new managers are just not going to be great for the first few years. And there's not really much, unfortunately, anyone can do about it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And
yeah.
there's a statistic that says something like a person becomes a manager in their mid-30s and maybe they don't get their first training until their mid-40s, which is astounding.
Crazy.
I know. And so, and remember, we talked about who they might have learned from. And so I think it's really interesting that for some of your points, like Gen Z wants to work for authentic leaders who have boundaries. And that feels attainable, but it feels like also a leader needs to be able to know and make those make those decisions on what is authentic for them. And is this like, if they're not happy in their job, guess what? Your direct reports probably know.
And you can feel it.
You can feel it. And it's not authentic. It's not authentic if you're not happy. But it might be a golden handcuff situation. So it feels like really the service that millennials can do to anybody that they manage, whether they're Gen Z or not, is to be fulfilled in their own work. Is that a good starting point?
Like they need to be more selfish, actually.
And
stop trying to people please so much. And it's interesting because I do feel like now that we talk about it, millennials, and again, like I don't know, you can probably talk a little bit more about sort of the Gen X culture, but I do feel like millennials are sort of a transitional generation because I'm seeing a lot of the criticism that were labeled at millennials when we started in the workplace at Gen Z. But then now I'm sort of seeing them start to make the same kind of comments about Gen Z that Gen X and boomers were making. But then I feel like they're also sort of trying to please both the older generation and the younger generation, as they become managers, and then they have to report to their Gen X and boomer boss, but manage Gen Z workers. And they can, like I say, take a playbook out of learn from the Gen Z playbook and learn to be more selfish in what they want at work.
Yeah, I think I really think this is, again, one of those things where we need to always pay attention to the things that the youngest generation is asking for, because it will benefit us all. It just really will. And the faster that we can listen to that, I think they're only, who knows what the one after that will ask for. What is it, alpha? Is that right? What they'll want.
But I mean, they haven't started work yet. They've just apparently started harassing Sephora employees, from what I've heard.
That's right. They'll have a really great skincare routine. We know that. Well, I just want to thank you so much. I want to hear about what's coming up next for you. What else are you working on, and what are you excited about?
So I mean, if you sort of are a Fast Company reader, I'm currently, still editing and writing about these kinds of things for a range of publications. What is coming up though is I am starting a podcast. It's still in its very early stages, but I'm going to start it with a journalist friend of mine who's actually based in Texas. And it's about recovering overachievers. So it's going to touch on a little bit about, what we've talked about, because I think a lot of the cases that I've seen around mental health and burnout tends to sort of focus on extreme situations, and it's like the
Mm-hmm.
before and after and how to tackle it. And then one of the things that I want to see more of is how do you build a healthy relationship with ambition? Because,
Ooh.
you know, you often hear stuff about, okay, I live this fast-paced life and now I live a slow life. And that isn't necessarily appropriate for everyone. Sometimes you have, when your ambition comes back, you know, it's not that you want to, I have found sort of like a struggle in knowing how to deal with that, because you obviously want to, you know, you want to honor it, but not do it in a way that's, you know, repeating those toxic patterns that got you into burnout in the first place. And so that's what I'm most excited about. But yeah, otherwise it's just like more writing and, you know, stories about these kinds of topics, and just like learning more about how the workplace changed, which it always is.
I am so excited for your podcast. I just did a podcast episode about how this was very ironic. I started my season this year was called Starting Slow in 2024. And then I was doing kind of like a mid-year review for myself, and I re-listened to it, and I had to laugh because I'm an overachiever for sure. And slow was starting 2024 slow to me was starting a couple of weeks late than I usually do, which is hilarious. And so I talked about this idea and the tension between wanting a very steady paced, slow life, and the tension of always saying yes to stuff because I know that I can get it done. And also, like, it's almost impossible to turn that side of my brain off. And so I talk a lot about values, and like I have a value of balance, but I also have a value of achievement, and often those are in conflict with each other.
Absolutely.
But they're still very much both important to me. And so anyway, I love that topic, and I think it is just so relatable. And so
yeah, it's like the messy sort of like journey. It's not about just I'm burnt out and I need to do all these things. And I don't know, that's something I'm not going to say, because I know some people say, oh, I started this podcast because I didn't hear anything about it. It's like, that's not true. There are conversations. I just want to see more of them, because I think it's different for different people. And it's just about, you know, figuring out how you sort of rebuild ambition and do it in a sustainable way. So I'm really excited about that.
Yes, a sustainable way. I love that. I love that a lot. Well, I cannot wait for that to come out. I will follow for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I will post the details on my website.
Yeah, we'll put that in our show notes for sure. Well, I just want to thank you so much for your time and for your thought leadership, and really excited that we're connected.
Yeah, really excited you reached out, and I'm really glad I found you, because now I know who I can reach out to next time I'm writing a story around managers as well. So maybe next time you'll be on the other side.
Love it. I love it. Anything future of work, current work, I'm there.
Yes, that is my that is my beat. So I'll definitely reach out in the future.
Yeah, sign me up, says my overachiever self. Yeah, I'm like, sure, I'll do it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, especially when you're self-employed. I actually think that the sort of like overachieving button really needs to be sometimes turned off.
It does. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many people go into entrepreneurship, because they want to get out of they want the autonomy and this promise of building the life that you want. And then you build this very busy life for yourself.
And then your boss is yourself, who's actually a lot harsher than probably any external boss that you've had.
Oh my goodness, Anisa, you are so right. Oh my goodness. Oh, yes. Well, I just want to thank you so much. I've had a blast talking to you today.
Yeah, me too.
I want to thank you so much for listening to the You Belong in the C-Suite podcast. If you are enjoying this content, please remember to rate and review on Apple Podcasts. By leaving a review, you are helping others find this content. We will be featuring 5-star reviews on air in upcoming episodes. Editing and support for the podcast is done by S&E Podcast Management. To get more tips and tools to help you live a life guided by your values, go to thecatchgroup.com. keep your boundaries, and take care.